This is part two of my Perceptive podcast interview with indie game developer Sydney, as we spoke more about being a first time developer, their game that was just released, and a lot more. You'll find a link to part one down in the description, and with that, enjoy the remainder of this podcast. Yep, and with how much we've seen in terms of to bring us back to your game with kind of like a the text-based visual novel angle, that there are a lot more developers, I think, really exploring like unique storytelling, unique storytelling devices when it comes to. I think horror is probably like the best example of this. Like there have been so many examples of very interesting original takes in horror that you wouldn't necessarily, I think about this being like an 8 to 15 hour long game, but it works if it's like a 30-minute, hour long, maybe at most a 90-minute title. I was thinking of, let's see, there was I think it was called Dead Letter Office that just came out at the time I was recording this. And as I told the developer on Blue Side, like, you just basically did, that's my job. I did the entry like that for some time, so it felt very eerie having to do that. There was a horror game about like doing like a restaurant thing that came out a few years ago. I mean, you can do horror in just about literally like any genre or profession, but it's something that, and I think to like bring this back to like what you're doing with your game and like how your approach to design is like when we think about games in terms of length. Like again, we're talking about an action-driven game. You have to adjust for player skill. Someone can play a game like Celeste and they'll get through every single level. First try, eyes closed, the whole deal. You'll have someone else who can take hours and hours to get through the very first level. If we're talking about a story-driven game, there is a very fixed amount of how long it's going to take to read, X amount of words. And of course, like, tell the story that you want to tell. So this is something I'd like to ask a lot of visual novel, kind of like very story-driven designers. When you're thinking about your game from like a pacing or a length standpoint, as obviously someone who's thinking about this from like a writing first point of view, how do you, I guess, like process that in terms of how long do I want this story to be?
Yeah, it's funny because I have written a bunch of screenplays. I've written feature screenplays, I've written short screenplays, and it's something where, like, this is not necessarily the right way to do it, but I also don't think there is, like, a right way to do it. In the beginning, as you're kind of, like, going through it, the story, in a way, kind of tells you how long it needs to be. So, like,
Mhm.
you can sort of decide, like, "Okay, I wanna tell a story about ghosts, and I want this story to be 90 minutes." You can do that. That's a totally fine way to tell a story. But I tend to just not do it that way, and I think it's because I'm very scatterbrained. And so I'll be like, okay, I really want to tell a story about ghosts. And then I'll just start writing it. And then I'll kind of get as far as I want. Usually, about like a third of the way in, I'll know how I want to end it. Sometimes I know how I want to end it, but I don't know anything other than that. So I start with the ending, then I kind of go back from there. But I will sort of figure it out as I'm going, right? Like, does this story need to be a feature? Does this story need to be short? Can I tell this story in 15 minutes? Can I tell this story in 1 minute? And as I was sort of working on Qualia, it's funny because it started out being a lot shorter. It was like a 5 minute game when I first made it. And then people played it and they were like, this is really good. And it was funny because I kind of thought that, like, not that I was doing something wrong, but I was like, "What, like, why is this what people are saying?" Every single feedback was like, "This is great. You should make it longer." And every single thing that was like any feedback session, any play testing, everyone was like, "Yeah, like, I just want more." And so I thought, "Okay, well, I guess I must have done something right because people do want to spend more time in this like little world that I've built, and it's about 5-10 minutes." And it's funny, I think I need to go back and change the intro because I say this is about a 5-10 minute game. I think probably if you get through everything, it is about 30 minutes now, but it also depends on how fast you read. Um, but it was something where I was like, I would have been happy with it just being 5 minutes. That was my original like intention. I was like, okay, that's how long it is. It's how long it took me to tell the story, and that's okay. But because people really responded to it and really liked it, this was kind of where my film skills and storytelling and writing were able to really like adapt because the game essentially is still 5 minutes to get, or 5-10 minutes, whatever, to get to one ending. But now, because it's a game and I can do branching narratives, it can also then take 5 or 10 minutes to get to a different ending. And then if you play it twice to get your first ending and your second ending, now that's a 20-minute game.
Mhm.
And it's still being true to your original 5 minute kind of duration of the story. And it was something that, like, I guess it wasn't that I hadn't considered it before, but it was an interesting way to kind of learn that, like, I didn't need to necessarily make my game bigger or longer. I could just add more to the existing story without changing a huge amount of like the original intention of what the story was. Which is, I think, I mean, that's probably like 101, like visual novel, like interactive fiction. You learn that you could do that. But something about like I knew that I could do it, but like doing it in practice was really different. Like being able to like have that realization and then try it and then like watch people play it was like a 3-step process of like, oh yeah, like this is actually how it works. I get it now. So I think that was something that was really like very interesting to see, and it really like solved the entire thing of like, okay, the story is going to be as long as it needs to be, and then instead of making it either longer or shorter, I can just either add more, right? So instead of being wider, it's now taller.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. It's something that I see a lot of developers start with, especially those who go into like roguelike design or roguelite design, where it's not about saying, here's my 2 hour long game, it's now going to take 5 hours to, or like 20 more hours to it. Here's like a 40-minute long playthrough, playtime, whatever. We're going to add more to that 40-minute playthrough. So you can play it again and again and again and get completely different things. A lot of people take again the wrong lesson and say, no, we just want to add more to it. This is a 10 if this is a 15 level game, we'll just add 40 more levels to it. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. And as you were describing like what like the feedback you were getting about people saying, we want this game to be longer. Again, there would be some developers who would think, okay, let's take my perfectly 2 hour long, however long story. I'll write another, 5 hours of story to this. I'll just extend this plot out again and again. And then what will end up happening, of course, is that people say, the story's too long. This game's getting boring. It's just running, in circles. And it's that challenge of parsing feedback. And again, we've been talking for almost an hour and 30 minutes. We could spend like 4 hours if we get on like playtesting and that kind of aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also being able to understand, like, really when someone is telling you, I want this game to be bigger, what they're saying is, I want to be able to spend more time in this world.
Yep.
And so that doesn't necessarily mean I want to be doing exactly what I'm doing right now. Instead of for 2 hours, I want to do it for 5 hours. That's not necessarily what they're saying. And I think that is when you run into stuff where, like, a lot of times players will get fatigue if you do that. And then if it's a game like, I don't know. So, recently I played Haunty, which is like, I don't even know how to classify it, but it's a really adorable, cute game, like perfect on the Steam Deck. I loved it. It was great because I could like go in, play like a couple like levels or worlds, and then like stop and then like do something else and have a day of work and then go back and play it later. And I think that was perfect. And I think if people were like, oh, I love this game, I wish it was bigger, normally you would be like, okay, well, I'll add in like 10 more levels. But then that's not actually what they want, because then they're just going to have to do more. And unless that game is like your favorite game in the world and you love every single thing about it, it's not going to really satisfy what you need, because they don't actually need it to be bigger. They need it to be deeper. They want to spend more time in like the details, and they want to spend more time learning about that world. They don't necessarily want to keep just like rinse and repeating the actual gameplay. And so for a game that is like a branching narrative game or interactive fiction, it's not about making the story necessarily bigger in one sitting. It's about, okay, we have your beginning and we have your ending. Now we can figure out if you do a second different ending, that will actually teach you more about your main story. So it's sort of like you get to have a bigger story, but it's still only going to be like however long your original loop is. And so that is something really great because you can
Mm-hmm.
do that one loop in one sitting and then you stop, put it away, whatever. Then you can come back and be like, okay, I'm going to do a different loop now and I'm going to learn more about this world without having to spend 50 hours sitting down playing one loop. And I think that's like a really interesting way to think about like narrative sort of architecture because it's not about necessarily changing the size of your story. It's just how the players can actually like receive that information.
Yeah. And I think this also goes to something you were saying earlier about the kind of like that mentality of sitting down and playing through a game versus having to come back
Mhm.
to it again and again. Because I've had that very same mindset with a lot of the indie games I play, where I will try and finish a game on stream or finish it within a day or two, because I feel like if I move on or if I go do something else, I'm not going to be in the right headspace to want to go back to this one. And then it just kind of gets like lost in the ether of all the other games that I have. And being able to, again, like, the appeal of your game in terms of the length is something that's very hard, I think, for a lot of developers, especially if you're new, to kind of figure that out. Because again, like, returning to the adventure and puzzle genre, for instance, I've seen puzzle games where right on the marking point it says this has 700 puzzles in it, and I'm just thinking, oh god, no, I can't do 700 puzzles. And but there is that difference of, okay, we're gonna give you these very inventive and original puzzles. Do how many as you want, and then it turns into almost like picking like chocolates out of a box. Oh, this one's I'm gonna try this one. Okay, now I'm gonna do this one. Now I'm gonna do this one. And it's all about, I guess, trying to figure out like what does it feel like to sit down and play your game, because it means different things from different people. To go back to the strategy example, sitting down and playing a game like Grouping Reverse Atlas is like could be like 5 to 10 hours. I've heard of people who've had like marathon sessions of Civilization, but you can't necessarily do a marathon session of a game like Gone Home or of
Mhm.
something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also something that like you don't want to kind of rush people with that story because if you're going to
Mm-hmm.
be playing I don't know, I'm trying to think of another really good or like I don't know, like What Remains of Edith Finch, right? You don't necessarily want people to like rush into that story and like try and like sit down and play it if they're like sleepy and like all of that. If they're like, "Oh, I got to finish this. I got to like make sure I do all of it in one sitting," right? You don't necessarily want people to have that kind of pressure and you want to be able to give them like outs in a way, like chapters that they can feel like, okay, if I do need to step away, I can and I can come back. And I feel like I haven't lost anything.
Mm-hmm.
And if that means that your chapter is actually an ending and then you get to start over again, that also works too. And I think in a lot of cases, sometimes that can be better. Cause yeah, I mean, at least for me, I definitely run into the like, if I put it down, I'm just instantly going to turn my brain off from it and it can be really hard to like turn it back on and like get back into that world because I think so much of story games like as you're going through them they're really like front loaded and so if you don't have that like experience in the beginning again when you're playing it you kind of every time you like put it down and pick it back up you like lose a little bit of that like immersion that you got in the very first time you played it when you were like starting and learning about the world and if there is like some sort of tutorial or whatever you're like really getting a lot of that information when you play it again, you don't do that again. You start
Mm-hmm.
from where you left off. And so you kind of have to just like remember all of that. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
And you mentioned the Talos principle earlier. I've had the second game in my library now since like sometime in 2024. I have not loaded it up yet. I just haven't had the time because I know that it's not just going to be a game I'm going to sit and play in 10 minutes. And it is very hard, like from the consumer standpoint sometimes, to figure out what game do I want to play. Because again, like you are talking to someone who has a backlog of over 1,000 plus games at this point on Steam. Like consumers, they get mind locked with maybe just like 3 games in their backlog. When I have all these other games on top of everything else I'm doing, it becomes that much harder. Now, again, as someone who covers games, I have the excuse if I can play games for work along those lines. But it is very hard sometimes to know just how much you really want to invest in a single game. And it's again why we've seen this kind of move towards more short form titles. Because the appeal of saying, I can sit down for one evening and get a complete experience is a lot better than saying, this is the game I'm going to have to play for 3 hours a day for the next 3 months. And you mentioned a Metaphor earlier. Like, I had to choose between either Metaphor or Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth as my big RPG to play. I went with Like a Dragon. And it was still a 60 to 80 hour long game to get through.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. And I mean, I think like, that's exactly right. So last year I did like the Steam recap thing, and I had played 134 games just on Steam last year, which I tell people that, and like, I'm not a game reviewer. They're like, what? How do you have time? Because everyone is too busy making games to play them, or they just don't have time for it. And so I think the reason I was able to play so many games is because they are shorter. And in the time that it would take to play and beat Talos Principle 2, I was able to play Mouthwashing and A Little Kitty Big City and, 2 or 3 other games that are really short, right? And so it's sort of like a pick and choose where like more people are going to be, I think, leaning towards the shorter games now because they're just easier to get through and you can do them in such a short amount of time that like it feels like less of a risk for people to do it, right? If you're going to play a game and you know up front, okay, this game is like about 3 hours, more people are going to be willing to try that and put in 90 minutes because it's only 90 minutes. As opposed to games like Metaphor, which we both have the same problem where like we look at it, I really want to play it, but I also know how long it's going to take me and I haven't started it yet because I know once I start it, I'm going to have to spend a lot of time. And if I'm playing Metaphor, I'm not going to want to play other games while I'm also playing Metaphor. And so it's a lot easier to have Metaphor on my shelf and be able to just like pull that out whenever I want to. And then as all of these like new little games are coming out, being able to just like play them as they come, spend like a day or two on them and then move on to the next one. And I think it really does depend on like your play style and like the type of games that you like. But at least for me, that's kind of just, that's how I like found my rhythm, right? Like if I'm playing games that are specifically for streams, I try to pick games that I can finish on stream. So again, that's only like one day of like the game. And then these other games I'll play like at night or like whatever during the day, and you can just go through them quickly enough. And it's not that it's like, I don't know, it's funny because when I talk about it, it almost feels like I'm describing these types of games like fast food, but I don't think that that's like a good way to compare it. I think it's more of like, I don't know, almost like hors d'oeuvres or something. Like it's designed to be small and fast, but not in like a cheap way. Like there's still a lot put into these games and they're designed to be played in a specific way that it's okay that they're small and it's okay that you play them quickly because that's like the point. And that's still great. And you still get an amazing experience from that. Like I think one of my favorite games that I played last year, and I always bring it up, I played Rat Shaker, and I tell everyone about this game because it is a very strange game where all you have to do is shake your mouse, and that shakes a rat. And so you have like a 3D modeled arm, and you're holding like a 2D rat, and you shake it, and like that's the game. And it has a really interesting mechanic on like shaking the rat is like how you open doors and all of this. But the game is like, I don't even know, like 30 minutes maybe a little bit less. And they made it for like a self-imposed game jam. And it is done really, really well. Everybody loves this game. And something about it, when I played it, just hit every single thing that I was looking for in like a weird little game. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it was so short and so small, it wasn't like, oh, it's great that it's short and small because I can play it quickly and then get on to another game. It was because of its size, they were able to tell that story in that amount of time. And it's like a complete story. I feel satisfied with the beginning, the middle, and the end. I've left the game with a conclusion. I can go back and play it again if I want, but also it's okay if I don't need to. Something about it, like the way that they just were able to kind of make that entire game in such a short amount of time, it just works really well. And I think more games, or at least more studios, as they're working on their crazy 17-year projects, should think about doing little games like that here and there. Because I think it is also just, like, creatively, it's a really good, like, palate cleanser. It's a really good refresher to just, like, force yourself almost to, like, make a self-imposed game jam. There's, like, less stakes in making the game itself, but also way less stakes for the player to be able to come in, play it, enjoy it, and then move on to another thing. It's interesting to watch. Yeah, I don't know. I've played so many games at this point now that I think I would try anything, but having that as like an option to have like a short game that I can enjoy and appreciate and then also go back in if I want to. Something about that is like way shinier and it looks like better candy than like Metaphor.
Mhm.
Sorry, Metaphor. I'll play it eventually.
Yep, and the kind of like idea of working on more short form games, I think the other advantage of that is that it does allow you to experiment with things that you can't really risk your studio on a weird idea that's going to take 3 to 5 years. But if it
Yeah.
only takes 6 months to a year, maybe even less than that, you can do something. And it's like you mentioned Rat Shaker. Again, we've seen so many like short form horror games that have blown up because of the fact they are this like very weird, very unusual experience that you couldn't necessarily make it work as a 40-hour long game. People wouldn't try, a $50 version of a game like Rat Shaker or Dead Letter Society. They would try, a $2, a $5, maybe a $10 version of it. One of the developers I've been referencing a lot in the last few months has been Strange Scaffold, who have been making a lot of very short form, very experimental ideas. I remember the interview Xavier Nelson gave that he was talking about how with something like with click holding that they could there is like the $5-10 million version of that game. You could make something like that. It would probably never recoup that investment because there's
Mm-hmm.
not an audience who will be willing to pay for like that amount of a game. But if you make a game that has that one unique selling point, and it's only like an hour long or 40 minutes long, and it resonates with people, you can do that again, and you can keep doing that. And it kind of again like to start to wrap things up. It's kind of like almost like a full circle moment of how much indie dev has changed over the past 10 years. Because I remember interviewing like developers who have worked on longer form titles that where the idea was I want this to be every single idea I have. I want this to be this perfect game of every system that I want. But if there's not an audience for it, if there's not enough of an audience for it, then there goes the entire revenue of your studio. But if you can make that one very bite-sized experience that maybe it only has 500 fans, 1,000 fans, but if that's enough to put you easily into the black for your next project, you can do something bigger. You can do something even more different and out there. But then, of course, the challenge is how do you market that? And again, that's another 2 hour long conversation.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because when I played Click Holding, I loved it. And I think it's exactly right. Like what you're saying, not only would they never be able to make any of that back, but also I don't know anyone who would be willing to like click their mouse for that long. So you're able to kind of do really weird things, not just like from a story perspective, but also from like a gameplay mechanic perspective, where you can kind of like force players to do something that they wouldn't normally do because they're only doing it for such a short period of time, right? Anyone can click for 30, 40 minutes. That's okay. And there's also like the accessibility settings, but like it's a lot easier to kind of boil the frog, which is a saying that I tend to like really like, even though it's completely inaccurate. You can boil the frog if it's just a, I don't know, smaller pot, smaller amount of time that you have to boil it, right? You can make someone do really weird things as long as they know they're not going to have to do it for hours.
Yep.
I would not be able to click for that long, but I was fine clicking for that amount of time. And I'm glad I did because it's an amazing game.
Yep. And there is that greater conversation about how do you keep someone going for like a very lengthy experience, because that is something that again a lot of developers have been chasing. When you look at something like an Elden Ring or what was it, a Vow that just came out, that there is that challenge of okay, this is a game that isn't supposed to be played in one afternoon. How do you keep someone engaged? And that is its own universe of challenge. But it is something that I think a lot more developers have to be thinking about. That I've been saying this now for like the last year or two, that we've kind of moved away from that period where you can just kind of close your eyes and try and make something work. That you don't need to care about the audience, you don't need to care about what's going on with the industry. You just sit in a cave and design a game. It's not really going to sell. Arguably, it may have never really have sold. Because again, there's so many people who don't understand why a game succeeded. To take this to like visual novel and text based, there's of course probably the first one to really blow up would be either like Doki Doki Literature Club or Hatful Boyfriend, the one that was about like pigeons. And a lot of people again will jump on kind of like the outer themes of that, but not really grasp why did this game succeed. To go back to the Strange Scaffold example, I'm sure there are developers who look at a game like Click Holding and go, well, I'll make the 80-hour long version of that. It'll be 80 times bigger, so we'll make 80 times more money. It's probably not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of this. Coming from film, I had just a lot of opinions on moving from a short film that had been adapted into a feature, because that was, again, like, bringing back to what I kind of talked about in the beginning, is that everyone's sort of end goal and dream is to like make a feature film. And most people don't like just jump in and make a feature. They'll make a short film first, that is their idea, and then they'll sell it and hope that investors will want enough money or want to give them enough money to be able to fund the feature version, and then they make the larger, bigger, longer version. And I think that almost never works, in the sense of, I think that the short film version of that idea is always better. It's always cheaper, it's more low budget, it's not going to look better, you're not going to have as expensive actors in it, you're going to have way more constraints, and in general, it's going to be a lot harder to make that short film than the feature, because you just have so many limitations. But 9 times out of 10, that story does better being a really short 5, 10, even 15-minute film than a 90-minute to 2-hour film. Because it's the same thing that we've been kind of talking about this whole time. Sometimes stories exist solely to be a certain duration. And if your story is designed to be written in a, small package, you shouldn't force it to then be bigger, because it's only going to be worse. And it was something that I don't think that will ever change in like the pipeline of like making a feature film. Most people will still make a short film and then turn it into a feature. And I think unless something changes, the feature is still always going to be worse. I don't know. It might just be my personal opinion, but I tend to really feel that way. And I think it's sort of the same with any story, right? In games too. Like, I mean, yeah, Clickhold, again, that's not going to be a game that's going to be really long. It exists as a short version of itself because that is the only version that it matters, right? That's the true version. Making it longer isn't going to make it better. It's just going to change how you receive the story, and probably not for the better. Yeah, I don't know. I see it all the time in film, and I'm hoping that doesn't happen in games, but sometimes it does anyway.
Yep. And like we were saying at the start, with kind of more uses of AI generation in games, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better in that respect. But it's also why it's so... Again, it's very hard to put into words, like, what goes into a really good game. Because I wrote this piece about a week or two ago before, at the time of this recording, where I talk about there's a difference between a good game and a successful game. Because a lot of people will think the two are the same. That, well, if everyone loved this game, or everyone bought this game, then surely that means I'll buy my next game, or the game after that. But just because someone bought your game doesn't mean they consumed it, that they enjoyed it. Because I've seen this, and for like people listening to us right now, like, I have seen games where, yes, it may have sold 500,000, 750,000 copies, only maybe 100,000 or 50,000 played that game for more than an hour. So if you go into your next game thinking, well, if 1 million people bought this, and 1 million people will buy my next game, so I should go even bigger, guess what? You're not going to hit 1 million copies sold, not in any reasonable time span. And with the example of kind of like short films and that kind of respect, Like I always think about like one of my favorites would be like the original Evil Dead's. With
Yeah.
again, like they were built on a shoestring budget. And you can do a lot if you're very creative in that respect. And it's again like to go back to like this whole idea of like trying to commoditize this kind of art form. Like I think about how so many movies these days just don't look like visually appealing or visually interesting to me. When I think about what they were able to do with stuff like the original Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street and again Evil Dead. So there is that you know consideration for having limitations and working around them in interesting ways that can lead to more creative ideas. Like with some of the games that we've mentioned, like even like bringing some like Vampire Survivors in, like these are games that were not designed to be an everything and everyone kind of experience. They were designed around a very specific look and feel, and it worked for people. Maybe this will work for 50,000 people. Maybe it will only work for 100 people. Maybe it will work for like 10 million billion people. But you can't go into designing a game thinking that, okay, if I put in X amount of hours, I'll get X amount of fans. Sadly, it never works like that.
Yeah, and I mean, even as simple as like, if your first game is about cats and your second game is about dogs, the cat people might not want to play your game about dogs. Like, it's as simple as that, right? And I
Yep.
think a lot of times people forget that. They're like, oh, well, they loved my game about cats, so they must love me and how I tell my stories. They have to now also love my game that is about dogs. That's just not how it works. And I think, like, in general, yeah, like, it's funny because Evil Dead is one of my favorite franchises, and something that it has kind of done throughout the years over the new like iterations is that it still really like lends itself to having very practical focused effects, which is something that I am always, even when I was in film, a huge like supporter of. I think that your limitations are kind of like your greatest strength in a lot of ways. So like with the original Evil Dead, right? Like all of that is physical, right? Like that's like actual like buckets of fake blood and it's like real pieces of latex because there's no way that Sam Raimi was going to be able to do any sort of like VFX or like CG. That
Hmm.
just wasn't something that you could do. First of all, when the movie came out, but second of all, no way you could afford that. And so I'm sure like in some ways you could think, oh well maybe Sam really wished that he could have done, crazy VFX, but because he couldn't and he had to do it practically, now that specific style is something that people want to emulate, even though it was only made that way because it was a limitation. They didn't even have like they made their own fake blood. It was like handmade with like sugar and food dye, and it was so horrible that Bruce Campbell had to have some different versions of his shirt because it kept drying and cracking. Like
Hmm.
that's not something that someone does by choice. You do that because that's what you need to sort of deal with in order to make your thing real. And I think we look at that now and we're like, "Oh my god, practical effects look so good. We're going to strive to do that instead of doing CG." Even though kind of now they're not the same amount of money, but they're still both very expensive. And you kind of maybe see this same thing in gaming where like some things have been done because they were, budget limitations or, I don't know, skill limitations or something. And that actually might be a good asset because if everyone has the same amount of money and they have the same skills, everything is going to look the same and it's not going to be very interesting and players aren't really going to want to play it because they already played one, last week. Again, with this oversaturation of just games everywhere, people are less likely to play something that feels similar to another thing if they didn't love that other thing, right? If like your genre is Slay the Princess, then you're going to play other Slay the Princesses. But if you've played it and it's not your favorite thing, you're going to play okay, well, I don't know, Fortnite because you like Fortnite. So, and that's fine. It's like not to like change players. The point is to sort of uh meet them where they're going to be, right? So if you're going to be working on something that you maybe can't do in the way that you want to, it's okay to kind of like rework it and do something different, right? If you
Hmm.
have limitations, think about that as like kind of like a game jam in a way, right? Like, okay, I have to make a game about potatoes. all right, that's not very interesting, but now it's your job to make a game about potatoes interesting. Because if you can just do a game about whatever you want, so can everyone else, right? But if you have a specific restraint, a box that you're forced to work in, it kind of lets you chill out about a lot of things in some ways, right? Like if you know, okay, I have to make a game about potatoes, you really only got to focus on making that interesting instead of having a completely blank slate of like, oh God, what do I make my game about? And I think that's why, I don't know, it's why people are more interested in very weird and interesting things that they haven't seen before because people tend to get fatigue if they see the same thing too many times. Unless, again, that's kind of like their shtick.
Yeah. And one point, I think this will be our final point, because again, we'll go for another hour or two, that I think what you said about kind of the differences between working with a limitation or a particular style, and then someone trying to emulate that style 5, 10, 20 years after the fact, we've seen this, I think, in a very big turn, like the last 3 years. A lot of developers trying to emulate the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 kind of like early 3D effect. And part of the problem I think that I have with this is that when you're working within that limitation, it allows you to, again, experiment, do interesting things. If you're just copying that as kind of the aesthetic or the brand, it sometimes doesn't really like go anywhere. It's just, okay, you may oh, my voice is dying. That's another sign we may have to wrap things up soon. But there's a difference between working with that limitation and doing something interesting or different with it because you have to, versus I'm going to use the most cutting edge computer, that can run ultra 4K graphics, ray tracing, and I'm going to use it to make a game that looks like first year PlayStation 1. And I'm going to use all this, I'm going to have all the same faults and issues with it, but I'm not doing anything else with it. It sometimes just comes off as being like very hollow to me. Because like pixel art is another huge, universe in that respect. There is a monumental difference between bad, good, and amazing pixel art. Even if you are just doing just literally like one block pixels of characters, there is a huge difference between like a game that looks like it really meant to use that versus someone who just said, well, I saw this in an Atari magazine or I saw this online. Let me just, copy this wholesale and then try putting in my game.
Yeah, and it's funny because this is like a really good sort of like tying the bow all the way to the very beginning, because I see this a lot with AI where people want to emulate a look and feel, but they don't know how to get there or they don't know why. And they'll use AI or just other shortcuts to kind of get them to that end result without really appreciating why do they want it to look like that? Why do they want it to feel like that? What is their, what sort of value is there for the player in it being like that? And so it's exactly like what you said. It's very hollow because it doesn't have all of that sort of deeper meaning underneath that, right? Like if you want your game to look and feel like a PS1 game, ask yourself why. Is it because you want it to be an homage to games that existed then? Does your game feel like games that, came out on the PS1? Or is it because you saw a game that was made on the PS1 and you're like, that looks really cool. I'm going to make my Fortnite look like a PS1 game. Like, okay, sure, that's like really fun and that's a novelty, but that's not as deep as people want. Even if they don't realize that they want it, like players, they're going to want that at the end of the day, because otherwise they're just going to get kind of like bored and tired of it because it's not going to feel any different than Fortnite without looking like a PS1 skin on it. You know what I mean? And they don't need the skin. They can just play regular Fortnite.
Yeah. And why does that PlayStation 1 aesthetic actually add to this game? Does it give the game a unique feel to it, or is it just there as window dressing? Because again, there's such a difference between kind of understanding why a game was made this way, why this worked, why this didn't work, versus just trying to regurgitate, okay, we're going to just copy Vampire Survivors, we're just going to copy Mario. And there's nothing wrong with making a Mario clone or a Vampire Survivors clone if you're trying to learn how to build these games. It's a different matter entirely saying, I'm going to copy Mario wholesale, slap a cell shading filter on it, charge you $4.95 on Steam, why isn't this game sold? Why haven't I made my $1 million yet?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lesson that game devs are going to learn because they're going to try it and they're going to see it doesn't work. And either they're going to be able to figure out why it doesn't work or they aren't and they're just going to keep doing it again. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something that even in film, even in sort of any medium, the natural way to kind of make something and to learn how to make something is to look at other things that are made in that medium that you really like and figure out why you like them and what it is about that particular thing that you like. And I am a big supporter of like not copying or plagiarizing or anything like that, but like if you see something like okay, in film, if you see the way that this particular scene is shot and the way that your actors are placed on the screen, Mr. Robot I think is a really good example where like you see the way that the show looks. There were so many different films and shows that came after it that copied that style. And it's because I think a lot of people think, okay, I really like this. I'm going to use that as practice. I'm going to recreate this and I'm going to learn how to then take this one thing that I like, but then change it and make it mine and then
Mm-hmm.
grow from there. And like, that's how art works. That's how you can make something really incredible from something that's been inspired by other things instead of just taking a thing that looks like another thing and saying, look, here, I made this. It's like, well, you did, but like, not really. Like, I don't see you in that. I see the other thing liked. And I think that's a big part of it is like, you need to iterate and you need to make something new that feels really distinctly yourself, even if it does draw from inspirations that are already out there.
Yep. And here's my final point. If you can't explain to someone why your game is interesting, why your game is unique, why you should play your game, the consumer's not going to do that for you. No one is going to come up with your own marketing tagline. And you have to be able to do this, whether you are making a visual novel game, a 2-minute long game, a 200-hour long one. Because you'll have fans who, again, to go back to your earlier point about people who want more of a game, they'll want more, but they'll want a very specific kind of more. And your example about like a cat person and a dog person remind me a lot of a conversation I had with Jake Burkett. We were talking about kind of the casual game market. And there are, again, this may sound weird to people listening, but there are hardcore casual game fans. There are people who want that very specific vibe out of your game. It must have, a female protagonist in a Midwestern town, solving a murder while trying to get a romance. That is their thing, and they will play that. They will buy every single example that they will find. But that doesn't mean, if you make one of those, that doesn't mean they're going to come back for your next game that could be set, I don't know, in the Northeast instead, and they're doing plumbing or anything like that. But again, it's about trying to figure out what is your niche. Who is the intended audience for this? And I guess I just lied about having a final point, but I guess this will be like my final question for you. To go with like your background in film, that when we talk about kind of the audience or the consumer in this respect, there are some developers who very much sneer at that idea. Again, this comes at it from like being 100% art focused. I don't care if anyone plays this game. I don't care if anyone watches this movie, watches this TV show, reads this book. I'm just here to create something 100%. And while that mindset is commendable, it oftentimes doesn't lead to that person surviving long in whatever respective industry they're working in. So with kind of, again, like going from film to games and kind of having this both this two-world experience, what are your thoughts on understanding the business side? Understanding that there are bills to be paid, that I need to be earning something off of this, or whether it's fans, money, or ideally both, or I'm not going to be able to do this again.
Yeah, I think it's funny because having now spent a lot of time in marketing, I do kind of have to think about that a lot. And it's something that whether I want to or not, I'm going to start thinking about that even before I make the game, right? I'm going to try and think about, okay, what is interesting for people to play, right? What would grab somebody's attention? And even though that's not going to be a deciding factor in what I end up making, it's something that I kind of have to think about from the beginning. And you can either have it be part of that story where your, marketing and your interesting hook and like your logline, whatever, all of your like sort of kit materials feel immersive and feel like they're part of the story. Or you can have it where you make something really incredible, you have a wonderful game, and then it's completely disconnected, and then you have a very like boilerplate cookie cutter, like, buy my game, I am selling it. And I think in the world that we live in now, with just the saturation of too many of like whatever it is that you make, and which is nobody's fault, it just is because there's just so many people making things, you want your game to be noticed and you want your thing to be appreciated and you want to grab some. Whether we want to accept that or not, it's going to happen. And I am going to make sure as much as I can that it doesn't feel disconnected from the actual thing itself. So one of the things, it's actually really funny that you're asking, because I'm going to be very brief with this, but as I was making this game, I knew that I wanted it to be free because I thought, okay, I'm really just interested in showing people that I can make a game and I want them to know who I am and I want them to play it. And I don't want it to be expensive or take a long time. And I was like, okay, free, short, great, easy. Everyone's going to like it. And I thought, okay, what inspiration can I draw from the past? Interactive fiction games have been around for a really long time. They are some of the first types of games that, we've seen. They're casual games that people can play. They're story-driven games that people, feel immersed in. I did a lot of research into Infocom, and it was something that I really didn't know a lot about. I never really played them, and as I was learning more about them, I discovered that one of my favorite authors, who made Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, had also made a game for Infocom called Bureaucracy. And so I did all of this research into that game, and then also there's a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game, like a text adventure game for Infocom as well, which I thought was crazy. And as I'm looking into like Infocom and I'm seeing all this stuff, I'm seeing, okay, not only did you get the game when you like got the physical box, but you would get all of these like materials with it. You would get all of these letters, you would get like physical like things that help you feel immersed in the game that you were about to play, because all of them were like in lore. So it's not just like a manual, like, okay, here's how you play the game. It's letters addressed to you, the player, who's the character. It's, 3D glasses. It's for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy one. It's like a little baggie of like lint from space, right? There's all of this stuff that feels really wonderful and is a huge part of physically immersing the player in something that they're about to do, which you kind of see with like collector's editions now, but it's not really the same. Those are also very expensive and there's not really a lot of stuff in them all the time. So I went back to this Infocom stuff and I thought about like this packet of stuff that you kind of get. And I decided to make my own. And so I'm going to release the game. And then shortly after I'm going to release the game, I'm going to have a packet that comes with the game. I'm going to do my best to learn how to figure out to put it on Steam, because I know that you can do like DLC PDFs on Steam. So part of the process, I'm going to figure it out. That's why I'm not going to release it when the game comes out, because the game's going to come out and I'm going to spend as much time as I can to figure out how to release it on Steam itself, so it's just more accessible. But I'm going to have a free packet of like an employee manual, but for the corporate tech entity of the game itself. So it's not a manual on how to play the game. It's a manual on how to be an employee at the company that's running the test. I have an employee badge. I have like a menu that has like the cafeteria foods that you can pick, meal vouchers. I have a ton of stuff in this like free PDF packet that I made, and I am just going to give it away for free, and people either really like it or they don't. But it also, I don't know, it kind of doesn't matter. it's an homage to that original interactive fiction text adventure story, but not like the game story itself, the story of like making that type of game and selling that game and giving it to people and letting the players feel immersed and part of the story instead of just sitting there and reading words on a computer screen. And it was something that I kind of like didn't really think about until a couple weeks ago, but once I did, I was like, well, I have to do this. Really, really important. I have to make sure that I can do it. I put off all the other game dev stuff and I made all this packet stuff instead. But I don't know, at least that's what I'm doing for this game. I don't know if everyone should, but I think it's about figuring out how to make your marketing and make you talking about the game not feel completely cold and separate and unrelated to the game itself. I think in my marketing brain, I'm always very, very obsessed with any sort of like engaging, immersive stuff, right? Something that I really loved, Devolver at a conference, I don't remember which one, they had weddings for Cult of the Lamb. And I thought that was incredible. They literally married people all throughout the conference. And sure, that's marketing, but it's also something that's really immersive. Like people really got married, it was officiated. And whether or not they cared about the game or anything, that almost like doesn't even matter because they go through that experience and now everyone who got to see it, everyone who was a part of it is like, wow, this is amazing. I really love this. And it was true to the narrative of the game itself, even though it was very clearly also marketing. And I think that's, for me, I would always recommend people if they do have to do the marketing themselves or if they want to be involved in that process, a way to make it less painless and a way to make it feel more like part of the creative process is to not treat it like being a vacuum salesman and treat it more of like, okay, how can I make this game that I've made feel like it's actually real? How can I actually bring that to life and make it feel like people are really a part of it? Yeah, that'll be my last thought because I could talk about this for a really long time.
Yeah. And again, there's so much to discuss. And yeah, this has been a great conversation, Cindy. So, to wrap things up for today, because again, for people listening, we can just keep going for like another. This is reminding me of my conversation I had with the developers who worked on that Gnome Bullet Heaven that we just spoke for like 2 to 3 hours, like it was nothing. And again, it's really great to have these conversations, still have them in 2025. So, to wrap things up for you, so in terms of the release of Qualia, and again, my mouth is dying on me as I'm trying to finish this. But in terms of the release of it, we are recording this just before Next Fest. Do you have a estimated release date for when it will be out?
I do. I haven't said it publicly yet. I don't know why I'm waiting. I think I'm just gonna wait until during Next Fest and then do like a marketing beat for it. But it will be very shortly after Next Fest.
Okay. And will there be a demo or anything else or like regarding that?
Yeah, so the game is in Steam Next Fest. There will be a demo. It's launching on Monday, the 4th. I'll probably do it like midnight, whatever the time before. And it'll be there for the entire duration of Next Fest. The demo is very short because my game is very short. So you can get a really sort of quick bite-sized snippet of what the game is going to feel like. It'll give you a chance to be like, yeah, I want to play more of this, or no, I hate this, and then you don't have to play the full one. And then I am still deciding, but I might just get rid of the demo after I launch the game because the game is going to be free, and it doesn't make sense to have both, maybe? I don't know. I'm still deciding. But yes, there's a demo. Play it. It's fun.
And you have anything to tease or what else you'll be working on after?
I'm working on 3 other games, but they're all with other people, so I don't know if I can immediately talk about all of them, but I will say there is a game that I am working with someone on that I had the idea for a couple years ago. It is a very weird multiplayer game that is not like Qualia at all. It is very funny and strange, and if you like a crab game or like Gang Beasts and I don't even know like another reference. I have like a bunch of them, but like if you just like a really weird kind of slightly janky multiplayer game that you can play with your friends, boy do I have the game for you. I will not say anything else yet.
All right. Best of luck with the release and for whatever else you're going to be working on next.
Thank
So,
you. Yeah.
for people listening to us, anything social media wise you would like to mention, promote, anything like that?
I mean just the game itself. But you can find me at Alsee, ALLSEE, Twitter, Blue Sky, and then my shiny new game studio, CMY2K. It's also on Blue Sky and Twitter. And then you can just see all of that. The website is cmy2k.net. Super easy to remember, but find me anywhere. Come and say hi. I love to yap, and I will talk forever.
All right. Well, Sydney, again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you this afternoon. And yeah, I'll be definitely checking things out during Next Fest. So, with that said, for everyone watching, be sure to do the YouTubing stuff, like, subscribe, buy all the copies of my books, etc., etc. As I said at the start, if you are a developer working on a game or just want to chat game dev, we can do very short or very long, depending upon how much you want to get into things. Please reach out. And with that said, be sure to come back for the discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And until next time, take care.